Shavua Tov, we read this week the story of Noah and the flood. The song on the Sabbath day says, Yona matzah manoach v'sham yanuchu yegiei choach. The dove found on the Sabbath day rest for its feet. And on that day, all of those who are weary of spirit or strength will find renewal. It's a song of praise for the Sabbath, implying that the dove rested on the Sabbath. Now, we'll discuss how do we know that the dove rested on the Sabbath, but it raises an interesting question. This little story of the two birds, the raven and the dove at the end of the flood, what's it there for and what does it teach us? Well, it may just teach us the secret of Noah's righteousness, a righteousness so powerful that it saved the entire human race. The Torah says about Noach ish tzaddik, a righteous man, tamim haya b'dorotav. Pure was he in his generations. With praise like that, you'd be surprised to know that some of the rabbis see in that praise a little bit of a sting. They say in his generations he was a tzaddik, because his generation was so terrible that by comparison he was great. But had he lived in a time of a tzaddik like Abraham, he wouldn't have been considered anything. It's very difficult to understand how the rabbis can criticize somebody who is described in the Torah as being tzaddik tamim, a pure righteous person. How can that be? I think that it's referring to not that there was anything lacking from his righteousness. He was completely righteous, but it was a different type of righteousness than Avram. You see, Noach is one among the most silent people in the Torah. We don't hear a word from him, not a peep. God tells him there's going to be a flood, go build the ark. He does it. He doesn't say a thing. The only time he speaks is at the very end of the story when after the flood, he plants a vineyard, gets drunk, he gets uncovered. His son Ham sees his nakedness, and then Noah speaks and places the destiny of his family in order, putting Ham and his descendants as the servants for Shem and Yafet, the older boys who treated him with respect and with dignity. Fine, that's the only time he speaks. Avram doesn't stop speaking. He's talking to other kings, to Avimelech, to Paro, to his wife, to his nephew, to God. He's interceding on behalf of the city of Sodom with a long negotiation. If there are 50 righteous people, 45 righteous people, Avram is talking all the time, calling the name of the Lord and proclaiming it far and wide. So, of course, if Noah would have been alive at that time, he wouldn't have been considered anything, as the rabbis say, because his righteousness was an internal one, but a powerful one. What was it? Let's take a look at those two birds. The flood is now waning. Noah we've already seen that Noah is somebody who does not hurry to do anything, and that's part of his secret. When everybody else is having children at the ripe young age of 85, he gets his kids when he's 500. It takes him more than a century to build the ark, and then when he's in the ark, he goes in at the last possible minute, and then he waits, and then it's 150 days, and then the water starts to go down, and then a few months later it rests on the mountains of Ararat, and a few months later the mountain tops are visible, and he waits another 40 days, and then he finally sends the raven, and then that doesn't work. The raven goes out and circles the ark. We'll find out why in a moment. You'll be surprised to find out why. And so he goes to 7 days more, and instead of sending the raven again, he sends a dove. The dove doesn't find anything, comes back. He waits another 7 days. The dove comes back this time with an olive branch. Waits another 7 days, sends a dove, and finally the dove doesn't come back. Noah now knows that there is dry earth, and he can leave the ark. And then God tells him, he still doesn't go out. God has to tell him, Tzei min hateva, get out of that ark. Right? So Noah is somebody who takes his time. What is the story with the raven, and what is the story with the dove? The raven, as you know, is a carnivore. And perhaps Noah, by sending the raven, was looking for a shortcut to find out if the water had receded so far that the earth was now visible and dry. Noah may have reasoned that the raven is a carnivore who will eat flesh, and will only find flesh if the earth is revealed, because that's where the carcasses of whatever animals or people or whatever would be. So that was a shortcut to find, has the water gone down so far that the earth is now revealed? It didn't work. The raven instead is basically circling the ark, and Rashi tells us a very amazing reason why. You see, the raven was concerned that if he went too far, who's going to keep an eye on Mrs. Raven? Maybe Noah is going to start up with Mrs. Raven. Does that make sense? That Noah is going to be attracted to a bird? I mean, what is that about? Well, that's one of the elements of the story. We need to understand that. Perhaps we can understand the raven as a representative of the world before the flood, the world that deserved the punishment of the flood. There's a Mishnah in the Tractate of the Fathers, Pirkei Avot, which says, "Hakin'ah v'hata'ava v'hakavod motzi'in et ha'adam min ha'olam." Jealousy, lust, and the desire for honor cause a person to be taken out of this world. These are the three deadly sins, if you will, of Judaism. So jealousy, that is the sin of the generation of the flood. The rabbis teach us that the generation of the flood was one that was full of theft, gezel. There were other sins as well, but the common theme was taking things that do not belong to you. And that is a direct outgrowth of jealousy. Seeing somebody else in possession of something that you want, though, you go and take it. So they were punished because of jealousy. Lust, well, I think that in the among the three stories of destruction that happened in the book of Genesis, that would be the destruction of Sodom and Gomorrah. For you read the verses, it's quite clear that there was a large element of lust in that story. And honor, the pursuit of honor, that's later on in our parsha, the Tower of Babel, where the people say, let's build a tremendous city and a tremendous tower and make for ourselves a name. But the flood is because of jealousy, and that makes sense that the raven represents that, because the raven basically lives by eating other living things' bodies after they are deceased. So that is a representative of jealousy. But not only that, the rabbis teach us through the Midrash that before the flood, many of the species of animals became corrupted themselves and were mating with members of other species. In other words, taking that which did not belong to them by nature. And so therefore it makes sense that the raven is jealous that Noah might be interested in Mrs. Raven, because that's the way the whole world was prior to the flood. In other words, the rabbis are teaching us that the raven represents the corruptness, the corruption is the better word, that was prevalent in the world that brought about the flood in the first place. And so, by sending the raven, Noah made a mistake. The great Chafetz Chaim, whenever he would send a representative to do a mitzvah, to raise money, to negotiate on behalf of the community with the government, he made sure to pick somebody who was a tzaddik, a righteous person, because he said Noah made a mistake, he sent the raven, and the raven failed. Therefore, when he sent the dove, that was successful, so we always have to send the dove. They tell a story about Rabbi Tzvi Hirsch Berlin, when he was considering becoming the rabbi in the city of Berlin. He wanted to know if the community was going to give him a hard time, if there were a lot of troublemakers there. So instead of sending one of his pure students, he sent an acquaintance who himself was a fairly liberal person, for him to go and see what the community is like and come back and report to him. And his students asked him, why didn't you send a tzaddik? Why'd you send this guy who's, got a reputation? And he said, exactly, because I wanted to see, if I sent a pure tzaddik, they would see evil people, but they wouldn't even know it because they don't see evil. So I needed to send somebody who knows a little bit what evil is. Just like Noah sent the raven, thinking maybe some people might have survived the flood, and maybe they'd be Rishaim, they'd be evil, therefore the raven would be able to tell. It's a humorous story, but it points out that the raven represents the corruption. And the nature of corruption, of jealousy, and of lust, and of the pursuit of honor, is that they are an immediate desire. I want it, and I want it now. They do not represent a long-term approach to life. They are basically instant gratification. That is what they are, and that's the raven. Instant gratification. It flies till it sees something to eat. It eats it, doesn't nest, doesn't make any kind of permanent dwelling, but instead it lives a helter-skelter existence. Noah then says, okay, that's not me. I am not the raven. I am the dove. And he sends the dove. And the dove, first of all, is a very systematic bird. The dove is a nesting bird. It will make a nest. It builds a home. It builds a future. It takes the long view. When it doesn't find anything, it comes right back. A week later, it finds an olive branch, which means that the tops of the trees are now visible. But that's not sufficient, because for the dove to survive, it has to be able to get to the earth where there are the twigs that it will use to build its nest. So the dove is taking the long view, and it's very systematic. Waits until everything is in place, like Noah. Now, how do we know? The song says that the dove found a place to rest on the Sabbath day. How do we know that? The Torah, when it says the first time that Noah sent the dove, the Torah says, "V'lo matzah hayena manach l'kaf ragla." The dove did not find rest for her feet. So how do we know that she did find it eventually and that it was on the Sabbath day? Here's a little bit of a midrash, that the second time that the dove came, it came with the olive branch. But when did it come? It came in the evening, the et erev, in the evening. Why in the evening? The rabbis in a midrash tell us that that it was the Sabbath day, and the dove didn't want to violate the Sabbath by plucking a branch off of a tree, which is one of the 39 forbidden melachot for 39 forbidden labors of the Sabbath. So it waited till after Shabbos was over, and then brought back the olive branch. And so therefore Noah waited another 7 days. That would be the next Sabbath, and then the dove didn't come back at all. So we see that the dove found rest on the Sabbath day. It's very nice. But there are some who question, and I always had this question, where did the dove find an olive branch? Hadn't there been this tremendous flood for the better part of a year? Didn't all of the branches, didn't everything get sort of destroyed? Where did the dove find this olive branch? So there is an argument among the rabbis as to whether or not the flood was also in Eretz Israel. So one rabbi, I believe it's Rav Sorotskin, in his book Osnaim LaTorah, suggests that the dove found a branch from a tree in Eretz Israel. And that's where it came from, that the flood didn't happen in Eretz Israel. And this brings us to a very problematic saying by a commentary by Rabbi Abraham Ibn Ezra. The Ibn Ezra, on the verse, Vayimachu min haaretz, that all of the living things were erased from the land, says, Mikan teshuvah gmura, here is a complete refutation of those chasrei da'at, those who are lacking in knowledge, who claim that the flood didn't happen in all of the lands. So the Ibn Ezra is saying the flood was everywhere, and anybody who says otherwise is chaser da'at, is lacking in knowledge. And all of the commentaries jump up and down and say, wait a second, this is a Talmudic discussion in the tractate of Zevachim. We have Rabbi Yochanan and Reish Lakish, two of our greatest scholars, arguing over whether the flood was in the land of Israel. One says yes, one says no. I happen to think it was, because when you drive by Cinema City in Jerusalem, there's Noah's Ark on the top of it. Now, I don't know if that's the real one, but if it is, that proves it, right? That also proves that Mount Ararat is in Jerusalem, which can't be, so forget that. At any rate, how could the Ibn Ezra call either Reish Lakish or Rabbi Yochanan, I forget which one said which, chaser da'at, lacking in knowledge? They say that the flood wasn't in Eretz Israel, so how could Ibn Ezra say anybody who says that the flood wasn't everywhere is missing in knowledge? What does that mean? So here's what I think it means. You see, I think that both Rabbi Yochanan and Reish Lakish agree that there was water in Eretz Israel, but not that there was a mabul. What's a mabul? The word we use for flood. But the mabul comes from the root of bilbul, of confusion. In other words, in other places, it was a hurricane. It was a tornado. It was a storm of tremendous intensity and confusion. The entire world got mivulbal, mixed up like it was at the creation of the world, where it was tohu vavohu, chaos. Physics are physics, and if the waters cover the top of the Ararat Mountains, which reach to a height of 16,000 or more feet, so then certainly that the water would cover the mountains of Eretz Israel, which are not even half that height, except for the Hermon. So therefore, there must have been water in Eretz Israel, but a mabul, a flood that came with a upheaval of a storm, that there wasn't. Because Eretz Israel is a land of order, not of chaos. There's a story about certain rabbis were leaving Eretz Israel, and they passed the northern border to what's called the Ladder of Tyre, and they saw that they were preparing the fields in the wrong season and doing things in the wrong order, and they were sad. They came back to Eretz Israel, where they prepare the fields in the right order, in the right sequence, where everything is ordered, everything is in place. Eretz Israel is a land of order, therefore there was no mabul, there was no confounding flood. Water there was, but not a confounding flood, and perhaps that's why this olive branch could still exist. Even though it was underwater, it was not underwater with waves and winds of 100 and whatever miles per hour. And therein lies the explanation of Noah. Noah is like the dove. He does not get caught up in the helter-skelter of jealousy, of lust, of the pursuit of honor. Anything that is appealing in the moment. He takes the long view. He looks to the future. He looks to posterity. And that keeps him in perspective. And that's how he's able to spend all of these long times before the ark, in the ark, waiting to see what's lasting. And that is the dove, who is systematic, and that is Noah. So when we are tempted by the impulse of the moment to indulge in something that we know is wrong, if we just stop and hesitate and wait, like Noah did, and take the long view, that is the source of the righteousness that can save the entire world. And we are blessed with a Sabbath day. Yona matzav manoach, the dove finds rest for her feet. It's a Sabbath day, it's a day of the long view, of getting out of the rat race for a while, getting out of all of the immediate demands of the various things we do, and taking a look at the long-term meaning of our lives, our place in history, and our destiny, and our legacy. Shavua Tov.